Okay, well, let's look at the points which were raised by Roger Lemon in the interview that I carried out with him. First of all, Dr. Greek, can you give me an overview of your position that animals do not and never will be able to predict human responses to drugs and disease?
Yes, and thank you again for having me, Pippa. My position is rather complicated science, I'm afraid, as it involves several areas of science. And all of these areas are not well known to most scientists, let alone non-scientists. So I guess the first thing I want to explain is something called complexity science, and then I will briefly go into why evolutionary biology and complexity science are very important in terms of this debate. In the early 20th century, there were two revolutions in physics. The first was Einstein's work on relativity, and the second involved the work of Niels Bohr and others, and it's referred to as quantum mechanics. Now, physics has not yet resolved the conflicts and the ramifications between these two paradigm shifts, but nevertheless, many people have heard of relativity and they've heard of quantum mechanics, but not many people have heard of the third paradigm shift that occurred in physics in the mid-20th century. That third shift was due to the discovery that many systems act according to principles that are not covered by Newtonian physics, relativity, or quantum mechanics. Now, some of these systems were shown to behave in a chaotic fashion, and that's where we get chaos theory from, and some of them were shown to be what is now called complex. The term complex has a different meaning in this context than what it normally means when people use it on a daily basis. Systems that are complex can be contrasted with systems that are simple. Simple systems include almost everything we experience in everyday life. For example, bicycles, flush toilets, a ball rolling down a hill, and an apple falling from a tree. All of these are simple systems. But an apple growing on a tree, now that's a complex system. Any living thing is a complex system, as is any cell in that living thing. Also, ecosystems are complex systems, and our economies are examples of complex systems. But simple systems are nothing more than the sum of their parts, and they have very predictable behaviors. Complex systems, on the other hand, are more than the sum of their parts. And what that means is even if you understand what every little part does, you will still not necessarily understand what the entire system does. Furthermore, complex systems have unpredictable behaviors. Now, the two most important characteristics of a complex system for us are, number one, they are not simulable, which means they can't be modeled. Okay, so that should stop us right there. The fact that they cannot be modeled is a very important characteristic. And the second characteristic that's important for us is the fact that complex systems are very dependent upon initial conditions. Now, let me give you an example of that. A chaotic system is also dependent on initial conditions, and an example of that is the weather. Very small changes can lead to rain on a different continent from where the initial changes took place. The classic example of this is a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and causes a weather front to move north to the U.S., bringing with it a lot of rain. So on a day in Texas, for example, where it would not have rained because this butterfly flapped its wings in Brazil, it does rain. So something as small as the wings of a butterfly can influence something as large as a weather front and can influence it dramatically. All right, so that's complexity science in a nutshell. Now let me just spend a minute talking about evolutionary biology. The way species evolve is through very small changes in their genetic composition. And this is what we call the initial conditions of an individual, or the initial conditions of a species. The initial conditions are the genes, the genetic makeup. Likewise, the initial conditions for a species are the genes, and so what has to happen in order for one species to evolve into another species is that the genes have to change. So by varying the composition of the genes, you can develop a new species, or you can even find two individuals of the same species that differ in their response to drugs and disease. Now, animals and humans are examples of evolved complex systems with all the characteristics that I just talked about, and this is why animals do not now, nor will they ever have predictive value for humans in terms of human response to drugs and disease. Now, the science that Dr. Lemon or Professor Lemon based his position on is quite frankly outdated. All right. Moreover, Professor Lemon didn't really even represent the old science correctly. But that is the basis for my position that animal models should be abandoned in terms of studying animals to predict human response to drugs and disease.
So essentially, to put it in everyday terms, you're looking at the very basic gene of each individual species, and without altering that, there's no way that a parallel in response can ever be got.
Yes, that's exactly correct. And another example would be the fact that physicians have observed for decades that identical twins are called monozygotic twins, but monozygotic twins differ in their response to drugs and disease. Now, in part because of what was learned in the Human Genome Project, we now understand why this is the case. Even monozygotic twins have very small differences in their genes. Both twins started out genetically identical, but because of random mutations or other reasons, a very small proportion of their genes end up being different from each other. And this is a tiny, tiny fraction of a percent that's different from each other. But what this means is that one twin will suffer from schizophrenia or other diseases, while the other twin will not. For example, one twin might develop cancer, and the other twin will not. One twin might develop multiple sclerosis, but the other twin will not. Now, these very, very small differences in the genetic makeup or the initial conditions of the individual lead to illness and death for one twin but not the other. That is how important initial conditions are, and if we're talking about living systems, that's how important the genetic makeup is.
So the slightest difference in genetic makeup can lead to the most immense outcome in terms of a symptom or a result or a disease.
Yes, exactly.
Dr. Lemon challenged the science behind the position taken by David Attenborough and the other signees. Now, this I found quite surprising, because I would imagine as a layperson that someone like Sir David Attenborough or Jane Goodall or any of those other people who've spent their lives working very closely with living creatures in their natural environment would perhaps understand the science behind the way these creatures, their physiological makeup anyway, just from their experience of being with them over so much time. Yes,
I think they would.
What's your response to Professor Lemon's view about that?
Well, I think what I've just covered is a very brief synopsis of that view, of my view. But I've also written and published over 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals, 5 books, and I have other writings on this subject. And in those publications, I make the case that I've made today that superficial similarity, which is what Dr. Lemon's position is based on, is not adequate in terms of using animals to predict human response to drugs and disease. And predicting human response to drugs and disease is exactly how animals are used today. Every justification that you will hear from the vested interest groups revolves around predicting how humans are going to respond to drugs and disease. So a list of my publications can be found on our website. Our website is afma-curedisease.org. That's afma-curedisease.org. And if you go to the resources section, there's links to most of my publications. So that's where I go into a lot more depth about this position, and that's certainly not suitable for a short radio interview. But my resources are available on the internet. You can read those. You can peruse them and come to your own conclusion if you so desire. But if one listens carefully to the interview you did with Professor Lemon, you will notice that he avoided directly answering many of your questions, and a lot of the answers that he gave, he hedged. He didn't really answer the question that you asked. He presented a slightly different answer or an answer to a slightly different question. And he especially hedged when you asked him about animals having predictive value for humans. Furthermore, he presented no science like I have today, or he quoted outdated science to support his position. And he did not direct, as I have done, the listener to a website or articles that support his position. The reason for this is that there is no current science to support his position. His position is based on wishful thinking and 19th century science. Old reductionistic notions about living systems has been replaced by our modern understanding of evolutionary biology, complexity science, and modern-day genetics.
His justification, for example, would be based on the systems that we share with non-human primates, such as the nervous system, memory, and language, without having gone back into the deeper, as you say, scientific basis to show that genetic makeup is really where it all starts.
Yes, exactly. That's strictly 19th century science. And again, the example that I gave about monozygotic twins is once again applicable. Yeah. Monozygotic twins share all of these characteristics that Professor Lemon attributes to human and non-human primates. And monozygotic twins share all of these characteristics and more. And yet even monozygotic twins, differ dramatically from each other in their susceptibility to disease and their response to drugs. So neither evolution nor science is ever going to produce an animal that is more similar to a human than monozygotic twins are to each other. And yet, scientists and organizations with a vested interest in vivisection continue to promote the position that unless they are allowed to experiment on animals, well, sick babies are going to die, sick adults are going to die, and, the world is going to come to an end. Well, the science simply does not support that propaganda. That is simply not something that Professor Lemon can back up. Moreover, when Professor Lemon was addressing this, he said that he was not talking about basic research, but in reality, most animal use is for basic research. Okay? So there's another contradiction. He also claimed that non-human primates were the only model for diseases of the nervous system. Well, I can produce many articles by scientists who use rodents and other animals who claim that their models are actually better than non-human primates. And all of this goes back to who has a vested interest in what animal. If you're a scientist who uses non-human primates, then you lobby for using non-human primates in research. But if you make your living from studying diseases of the nervous system in rats, then you say all the same things that Professor Lemon said, only you say it about rats. There's just no science involved in this. It's all about money and ego.
Dr. Greek, I think that's important for people like me and the public generally to understand, because we can be very easily won over by an argument that Professor Lemon will put forward, stating that that non-human primates are the only model that we have, and that many advances in medical science or most of the advances in medical science, as he states, have come from studying animals. It's easy for us to be seduced by that argument in the absence of any further knowledge about the situation. But the fact is that this is a business, and that's something which is kept well hidden from us.
Yes, that's exactly right. In reality, the only model that we have for understanding human disorders of the nervous system is humans. Human-based research, along with advances in technology, have gotten us where we are in terms of understanding these diseases, and further advances in technology and further advances because of human-based research will continue to lead to improvement in patient care. Animal models, on the other hand, have consistently led scientists down blind alleys that resulted in harm to patients, but Professor Lemon isn't going to tell you about that. And finally, Dr. Lemon spoke of not having any alternatives to using non-human primates. In fact, there are no alternatives to using animals in research in testing at all, because such use is not effective. Okay, it just doesn't work. By definition, you cannot have an alternative to something when that thing doesn't work in the first place. Okay, that would be like saying we need an alternative to a perpetual motion machine in order to generate energy. Well, perpetual motion machines don't exist. Okay, so that kind of sentence structure is just nonsense masquerading as science.
One specific example when questioned that Professor Lemon mentioned, and I've seen him mention this in written articles that I've read, and of course he said it in the interview that I've carried out with him, and when pushed about an example, is the deep brain stimulation used to, in his opinion, bring about some pretty interesting medical results for use in Parkinson's disease and various others. Now, this is deep brain stimulation specifically on non-human primates. Can you tell me, I suppose to me it seems fairly clear that a monkey's brain is going to be similar to a human's brain. If you open it up, it's going to be able to bring motor neuron responses in a way that you would expect. What is the science behind his justification for using these?
There really isn't any. His justification for using this is 19th century science, which says on a superficial level, non-human primates and humans have a lot in common. And that's right as far as it goes. But the superficial level is not where response to drugs and disease occur. Okay, it occurs on the cellular level, on the genetic level, and so forth. And that's where the fact that humans and animals are complex systems comes in. You cannot build a complex system from the ground up and know how the complex system is going to respond. All right? And in terms of the deep brain stimulation controversy, I've published an entire article on the history of the development of deep brain stimulation. And in that article, I go into great detail about where animals were used, where they were not used. And I also contrast what scientists knew from studying humans long before monkeys were used versus what is claimed by the vested interest groups about experiments on monkeys. The bottom line is that monkeys were not involved in most of the discoveries, and even when they were used, they weren't necessary. All of this kind of goes back to the fact that the vested interest groups always portray every experiment that is, or every advance that has ever come from medicine as being dependent on animal models. And that just isn't true. Now, that position is difficult to refute because it's been repeated so many times that society and the media and everybody now treat it as if it were actual fact. But the reality is very different. In the 19th century, scientists did learn things about humans by studying animals, but these were things on the gross level. Okay, these things include knowledge about what various organs of the body do. For example, what is the purpose of the liver? Okay, essentially all mammals and even most vertebrates share common themes. For example, the heart pumps blood, which circulates through the body in a circle, and then it comes back to the heart. Okay, this is a characteristic shared by a lot of animals. This was worked out mainly on frogs and finally was demonstrated on a horse. But what is left out of all these stories and these claims is that scientists could have studied humans and discovered most, if not all, of these very basic characteristics. Now, regardless of how they were or were not discovered, animals could have been used. Okay, animals could have been used because we do have things in common with animals. But what biomedical science is doing today is as different from figuring out the function of organs as 16th century Newtonian physics is different from Einstein's physics. I mean, they're just two different things. Today, what we want to know is how an individual patient is going to respond to a drug, or why one patient contracts cancer while another patient does not. Okay, today we're trying to practice what's called personalized medicine. And studying animals is not going to inform us of anything at this level of study. They never have and they never will. And again, this is because animals and humans are complex systems. They're not simple systems. And they have very different initial conditions in terms of their genetic makeup. This is current science. This is not science based on stuff that we thought we knew in the 19th century. And Professor Lemon needs to address that if he wants his arguments to be taken seriously.
Vivisection as a subject to be consumed by the public, if you like, is something which has changed over the decades. I remember when I was young, those who fought against vivisection were considered actually almost to be akin to terrorists. You know, back in England where I grew up, there were a number of high-profile issues, and the public were made to believe that those fighting for the rights of animals were people who were hell-bent on doing harm to those who were carrying out experiments on animals. This mobilization of public opinion is immensely important, it's also gaining a huge amount of ground. And whereas the deep science background that has always been used to, I suppose, patronize the public into not being able to understand it and therefore not being able to lobby against it, really has been, I suppose, brought into question by somebody like Sir David Attenborough putting his name to a letter like this. This particular individual can make a huge difference to continuing the mobilization of the public to actually sit up and listen and shout for the debate that you're calling for.
Yes, indeed. And, all of this stuff is very complicated. And I feel sorry for people who don't really understand the science behind it. But a vast majority of people don't understand the science behind it. And the fact that you have people like Jane Goodall and David Attenborough questioning the science that it's based on, that should alert people to the fact that, hey, this is not settled science, okay? In fact, the position that I have can only even be fully understood by a relatively small percentage of scientists. Yeah. Because my position covers different areas of science, and most people are just an expert in one small area. So it's not reasonable to ask people to read, for example, my paper on deep brain stimulation and judge whether Professor Lemon is being truthful or I'm being truthful or who's right and who's wrong. A vast majority of people simply lack the expertise to make a judgment. Okay? But there are experts in these areas who are impartial on the whole animal use in science debate, and their voices have never been heard. So as you alluded to earlier, we've been calling for a peer-reviewed debate on this issue now for many years. When one publishes in the scientific literature, one's peers, that is other scientists with expertise in that particular area, review your work and they decide whether or not it should be published. Okay, and that's called peer-reviewed science. And we have called for those on Professor Lemon's side to prepare a position paper where they explain their position and answer the questions posed by my position. And I'll do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then a dozen or so agreed upon experts will read the papers and render a decision about who's right on the science. All right, a short public debate can follow that, and then the experts can announce their decision. But if the science does not support animal experimentation, there should not be an argument about the ethics of using animals in research and testing. It simply should end because it's not scientifically viable. And so that's where I'm coming from, and that's what I'm trying to promote is, let's get some people involved in this who don't have a vested interest in it, but who are experts in these very tiny fields and who can say, Dr. Greek is full of it. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Or who will say, yeah, Dr. Greek has a point. This is current science. Animal models do not do what the vested interest groups claim they are doing.
What do you say to Professor Lemon stating that you personally, in your line of expertise as a medical professional, and that being anesthesiology, have used treatments which would have had a contribution from animal experimentation at some point in their making?
Yes, again, that's a very common claim. That's what the vested interest groups say time and time again. And they've said it so many times that society now thinks it's a fact. But it's not a fact. When one scrutinizes that claim in light of current science, it just doesn't hold up. And then when you scrutinize the claim in terms of history, it doesn't hold up there either. So for one reason, people with a vested interest group in vivisection are confusing a correlation with a causation. In other words, just because animal use is correlated with medical advances does not mean that animal use caused these advances. Second, approximately 90% of all new medications that are currently shown to be safe and effective in animals are in fact ineffective and sometimes even toxic in humans. 90%. Now this is a terrible track record, and this alone proves that animal models fail at what they're supposed to be doing, namely predicting human response to drugs and disease. Furthermore, animals don't keep bad drugs off the market. They just allow drugs to be selected for development in what amounts to a random fashion. When new medications are developed in a random fashion, some are going to turn out to help humans, but most will not. And that's what we see. We see that 90% don't. And of the 90% that don't, a lot of those turn out to actually actively harm humans. Okay, so the net effect of animal-based research and testing is very negative for patients. But again, this is why society needs a peer-reviewed debate in order to sort all this out. And so we can let the science speak for itself. Society needs scientists to use research methods that are scientifically viable, regardless of what they are. So there should be no hesitation on the part of anyone who values science or who values curing illness to participate in such a debate. And then we let the experts in these issues, decide, and society can go on from there. But like I've said, we've had absolutely no success in trying to convince Professor Lemon's side to participate in a peer-reviewed science debate. And in my opinion, the reasons for that are that this is not about science. This is about money and ego. Okay, this is not about compassion for human beings or, using the best current science that's available. These people have a huge ego. They have a huge vested interest in this, and it's going to continue until something, pretty big happens.
Dr. Greek, focusing on the United Kingdom, up to date, to this date, 122 members of the UK Parliament have signed 4 parliamentary early day motions, EDMs, calling for a properly moderated public scientific debate hearing about claims that the results of animal experiments have predictive value for human patients. Now, this the level of scientific debate, calling on scientific expertise and the importance of this fair hearing has to be, I suppose, illustrated by a success that you actually were responsible for. And I think we should just mention this because it shows that when given the platform to put forward the arguments, actually opinion fell in favour of your campaign. And this was actually to stop the opening of a primate lab by Cambridge University. Just give us a very quick overview of what happened with that, please.
Well, Cambridge University petitioned the United Kingdom to allow them to open a huge primate facility there to perform the kind of research that Dr. Lemon is talking about. And so it went to a hearing, and in the UK they have a system that allows you to have hearings on these issues, and they had an inspector, a man who was an engineer, and who actually did understand what a complex system was. And I spoke before the inspector. The animal experimentation community spoke before the inspector. We gave papers backing up our positions, essentially a small version of what we're calling for now in terms of this peer-reviewed debate. And the inspector ruled in our favor. He said that the vested interest groups, the animal experimentation community, had not proven that their work was vital, that he saw, nothing in their presentation to contradict the things that I had said in my presentation, and he ruled in our favor. Okay, so in my opinion, that's the only time in history where something like that has ever occurred, right? All the other debates and to and fro that have taken in terms of the animal experimentation issue, we've never had a judge sitting there who was himself an expert in areas of science. So the one time that we have had an expert judge, he ruled that animal models were exactly as I have said, of no predictive value for humans. So I think, that's been a long time ago. That's been probably 15, 14 years now. But that was kind of overlooked by a lot of people in the media. But that was a huge deal. That really does validate what I've been saying and what I continue to say.
Much of your focus and your work has been centred around, as we've just mentioned there, the Cambridge University primate lab, and you've presented in the EU Parliament. Can I ask you, Dr. Greek, why more on this side of the pond than in America itself?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it. I can make conjectures, but there are differences between America and Europe. Not just in this issue, but in a lot of other issues, more political issues. But certainly Europe is more attuned to the problems with animal experimentation than America is. Maybe it's because America's perhaps more money-oriented. Perhaps I really can't give you a reason. But there certainly is not a lot of interest in America in even exploring this as a topic, and that's very unfortunate.
And it's, I think, relevant then to mention that certainly in the United Kingdom, this debate isn't going away. The EDM's evidence provided by your medical board and the debate conditions have been endorsed as well set out and fair by Michael Mansfield QC, who's a very well-known human rights defence barrister in the United Kingdom. I think many people will know his name, and I think it's worth mentioning that too. Dr. Ray,
and that goes along, Pippa, with David Attenborough's letter.
Yeah.
You know, he only had 20 scientists sign that, but all of those scientists were people whose research and areas of expertise revolve around the brain. And while the letter that Professor Lemon was representing had 400 signatures, but all of them had a vested interest in animal-based research. I mean, that speaks for itself.
Yeah.
That I'm almost embarrassed for them that they get all these people, but the only people they can find to sign it are people with a vested interest. That's laughable. I don't know why anyone would take that seriously.
Unfortunately, it is a pattern that we seem to see in many sort of particular areas of industry, whether it be pharmaceuticals, food industry, and in this particular case as well. Dr. Ray Greek, I thank you very much for your time today. You've had the opportunity to answer Professor Roger Lemon's questions. Let's hope that at some point in the future, he may well come face to face and have that debate with you in a proper arena where this can be really thoroughly looked at.
Pippa Jones on TRE